Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. Questions from John Keating at the 70s Card Show, podcaster and friend. Looking forward to cutting through some of his many questions and comments that he sent. Thanks, sponsors, Topps, Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins & Scott Auctions, Mike Stave Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. First, Keating question. What's the story behind the card choices for the cover of Price Guide number, talking about the Sport Americana Baseball Card Price Guide that came out in 1979. Actually, the white cover was the original cover that Denny had designed, and that came out in March of 79. The brown cover, which is the one John is talking about, came out in July. After Denny and I self-published the white cover, we had interest from a guy that worked at a publishing company that was a serious collector, and he said, you guys have something good. Can I help you get this into bookstores? Can I do a book distribution agreement? And we were open to that, especially because he was a good guy. He was a collector. He really understood. We were servicing the hobby. And he said, I've got a great sales guy that can get you in all the bookstores. But you need a different cover. You need a better cover that's going to look better. And so he had one designed. Those cards probably were mine. John, you're asking, how did you get a 79 Pete Rose on there? This was early summer, perhaps, that the 79 Rose could be on there. And he was a big deal. But this was the second cover. It's actually easier to get. There were more produced of that. Second question, John says, your podcast is the best history book I've ever ingested, but I'm probably the worst student you've had. 45 years in and you're still schooling me, but thanks for the stories. Well, John, you haven't been in my class except for the last 5 years. The first decades, you may have been doing some remote learning by getting the magazines and the books, but I don't know that I'm your favorite teacher, but I will say this, there are no tests, there's no grades, and you get an A and you get an A. When I was teaching, I had obviously some academic rigor, but nowadays it's pass, fail, and you pass because you showed up and you paid attention. My big secret when I was a professor is just the teacher ought to make the material interesting and make you want to show up for class. And I did that mainly by using sports examples. So people selected my class knowing that, and the word got around. Next one, talking about the Tough Cards episode that Rich and I did. He said the concept and mystery surrounding vintage scarcity is one of the great joys of vintage collecting, but not sure as older collectors die off that some of that might be lost. And I just would say two things, John. Excellent question. Supply was way more important in the old days, and now it's mainly about demand. So if vintage cards do not have strong demand, they can go down in value in spite of their scarcity. So this is the Sports Card Insight, is if you look at old price guides, and not just pre-COVID, but if you took price guides, especially books, and looked at what cards were selling for relatively, what cards were worth more than other cards before the boom, and I'm talking about before COVID, I'm talking about in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, the farther you go back, the more it was about the relative scarcity. Nowadays, it's more about the demand. Good question, John. Next, he's talking about the audit aspect of Fanatics and Topps, responding to concerns. He said he's got lots of questions on how they did it. Again, this is the selective transparency on a need-to-know basis. They just want us to know they did an audit and they passed. Because he's saying, what about the sample size, or how did they do it? I don't think they want to tell their competitors or us how they did it. But I will say this, if you are completely transparent, sometimes even when there's a random process, and I know this from my professor days, can look non-random after the fact. If you keep testing data against every conceivable hypothesis, eventually one of those hypotheses will appear to be significant. I say appear because if you just test and retest the data, then you'll find that one region of the country or had an unusual number. Again, it's just the randomness of the way things work. I'd like to know more too, John, if they ask me my opinion. I've already given it somewhat, but I think they're on to the next time they do that. I hope they'll do that periodically, and I think they probably are. And they have Fanatics Live to see what's going on there. Again, Fanatics Live, that would be the concern that they're getting. Many of the big hits are going to their best customers. Next, John's idea, when we talked about the hostess cards, he said any kind of a food tie-in with cards is a good deal. And he says the WNBA, the women's soccer, if they were connected with Girl Scout cookies or anything in the supermarket food aisle, would be terrific and would be a way to approach the 10X. Plus, he says each package could have a 1-800 number to donate the food that you don't want after you keep the cards that you've ripped and do want. I don't know that the food companies would want to be that explicit about that, but that's an interesting thought. I agree. I don't think anything should go to waste. Then the cataloging episode I did with Rich, he said he's been outed as an OPG, the online price guide that Beckett has done since I was there, which I think is a great product. You've outed yourself, John. You keep referring to it. It is not perfectly complete, but it is more complete than anything else, I think, out there. But the values are really difficult to maintain. And Rich and I were right in the thick of that back in the day. And John says it feels like Beckett, the company, doesn't revisit or update vintage sets. Frankly, it's tough, John. It was tough when Rich and I were there. We basically would start updating when we were in a book cycle, and we'd literally go from A to Z. We'd get finished. The book would get published. We'd take a short break, and then we had to start all over again. Maybe it was the next year or the next sport, but it was a continuous updating. Once you got done, you needed to update and start over again. And you just can't do that every month. You can't do it every day. Every year or two is how we did it. This question gives me an appreciation that there are millions of SKUs. And if you want to update them, I have hope for some AI solutions, perhaps. On the Wingman episode, he says he's a lone wolf, but I've had dinner with him at several of the national. But just hanging out at the show and going around, I like to go by myself most of the time, but he's analytical, so am I. He said wing persons slow him down and are drag on his efficiency. And then he talked about shopping with his wife. Again, John, that's a different category. If you're going to take your kid or your wife to a show and they are not interested in it, yes, that will probably slow you down. If they are interested, that's a different problem. Then they're going to want to stop and see what they want to see. It is tricky, but I'm talking about a wingman, probably emphasis of a buddy that understands I want to do my own searching. And Rich does it. Brad was very helpful, and Gabe, I've mentioned others, and you've been helpful too. You really came through for me back at the Atlantic City National, and I appreciate that still. Let's see, another one. Not all fans will collect. He's not pushing back on that. Actually, as he often does, he's got an opposite approach to it. Basically, he understands that not every sports fan is going to be a collector, but he's noticed that his passion for the sport has declined, even though his hobby interest in the sport is more acute than ever. That's well stated. I think the more you get into collecting, it becomes difficult. Let me give you a little experiment. You have a choice of either going to a ball game in real life or going to a card show in real life or staying home and sorting cards and watching TV. Of those three choices, number one, I would go to the card show. If there's a card show that's 20 minutes away, like the Waters Creek show is, and it's that weekend, I'm there. If there's not a show and there's the ball game of one of my favorite teams or a good game on, I'm going to stay home and I'll probably be watching the game, listening to the game, but also sorting cards. And lastly is going to the game, just spend 4 hours, parking, food, in and out. So I'm more sports card guy than I am sports fan guy. Next, talked about grading, and I was interviewed by Cage, lawyer, about fixing BGS, and I'm just being reactive. He's asking me the question, but what John is saying is that reactive behavior isn't what made Beckett grading great back in the day. And I do agree, but I think that the company has been playing defense since COVID, since the work stoppage. I understand it, but I don't like it, and I'd love to see him get back playing offense. That would be my style as well. Then he asked about the grading consistency, episode 1256, and this would go for any of the companies. Do graders keep data of sizing discrepancies, or do they continue to work off standards established decades ago? I'm curious as to what percentage of cards that get denied for sizing from one grader are accepted as normal for another. Basically, the simplest way for me to say this is that if something is supposed to be 2.5 by 3.5, 2.5 by 3.5, the standard size cardboard, and I think all the grading companies can measure it. And if it comes out, not a millimeter less, even slightly less, if it's perceptibly less, John, it gets bounced because it's suspicion of trimming. And they can't say it was trimmed. They can look at the edge. And even if it was pulled out of a pack, if it doesn't meet the standard size requirements, most grading companies are going to bounce it. Now, if they don't, I think there'd be a reputation for the card company that gives leniency, and then the trimmers can have a field day. I watched the videos when a card gets trimmed, if there's a way to make it look like it wasn't trimmed, which there is in terms of the edges, then that's a problem. So it just doesn't meet the minimum size requirements. Now, even if you trimmed it, but you trimmed it above the tolerances, so it's slightly more than 2.5 by 3.5, they'll grade that in many cases. So it cannot be below what is the standard recognized size. Even if it came that way out of a pack, it's too bad. Okay, he said, what's the most time-consuming portion of the grading process? You'd assume the actual grading was the most time-consuming. You're talking about how Greg Morris can grade in seconds, and anybody who's graded 1 million cards can know pretty quickly what it is. But he said, if it's 45-day business turnaround, are they spending less than 5 minutes total with your cards? And that doesn't sound right to him. But first of all, there are problems. You have 7 steps. There probably are more. First, they have to receive your box, and they have to open it up, and they have to open up with care. They can't be speedily opening it up. They've got to be carefully opening up. Then they've got to put it in a bin, and they've got to make sure they know this is coming from you. Then they have to ID the card, which again is not trivial. That sometimes can take long enough. Frequently, it's a piece of cake. Number 4, perhaps, is the actual grading, where it's presented to a grader who's looking not at a scan of the card, but the actual card under magnification and special light. And then perhaps there's verification from there. If it's a more expensive card, maybe another person is coming, and the grade is, say, finalized. And then 6, it goes to the slabbing, and slabbing, it does take a while. Speed is not of the essence. The slabbing machine is a heavy, finely calibrated machine. You don't want to damage the card. You got to get the flip in there just right, not upside down, not slipping around, the inner sleeve, all that stuff. So the slabbing is not trivial. That takes a little while. And finally, even when you're all done, you've got to make sure that card gets into the box to be shipped back to you or picked up or whatever it would be. So there's a number of things there. And when you add it all up, I'm not saying it takes more than 5 minutes or less than 5 minutes. I'm just saying it's more complicated than you think. And the grading is the most important thing. But if you're grading it at 10, but you misidentified it, that's a problem too. Lastly, he's asking about junk slabs. He's talking about a 90 Donruss Dale Murphy that gets a PSA 8 or 9. He said it's still a 30-cent card. Let's say it's a 50-cent card. It's still not a card that anybody's very excited about. But my point is, what if it's a PSA 10? I don't know that should be so much. I'm not in charge. If people want to collect PSA 10s and pay a premium for very common cards, that's okay. If you get an 8 or a 9, you're deflated. You got it back. You paid $20 to grade it, and you can't get $20 for it if it's an 8 or a 9, a 9 even, but certainly not an 8. So it could go in a $5 box. Even then, you're trying to justify it. Here, you're going to be able to get it for less than the cost of grading, but no one would grade it. If they knew it was going to come back, they wouldn't. And then he also mentions that he's noticing that the delta between Mail and Mays seems to have narrowed. He says in recent decades, I think it's been since Mays passed away, because it does not include Mail going down as much as Mays going up, and recognized as being absolutely the equal, at least the equal on the field. And then he says maybe the same thing will happen with Barry and Kent Griffey. Another analogy for you. We got a card and we got a card in the slab. It's like having a house on a lot. If it's a good house on a bad lot, that's a good card that gets a bad grade. What are you going to do? You probably crack it out. Or, as he said, if you're going to have to sell it at a discount. What if you have a bad house on a good lot? That's a bad card that got a high grade. I think in the future, other than registry considerations, that's not a good deal, because in the real estate world, you have a bad house on a good lot, they're going to tear down the house. Or if it's a good house on a bad lot, they may even move the house if it's not so big that you can put it up on stilts and move it out. Just because you take a $5 card and pay $20 to grade it doesn't mean it's worth $25. Just like a house. You buy a lot and then you pay to build it. The sum of the parts does not always equal the whole, and frequently it equals a lot less. That's true in real estate. It's true in cards. Be careful in what you send in. And if somebody else sent it in, to me, that a PSA 8 90 Donruss of Dale Murphy is not a bargain, even in the dollar box. Maybe somebody would want to pay $5 for a junk slab, but that's not the way I want to spend my hobby time. So thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. I'll be back again in a couple of days, another episode.